This is GARIS, Masculist, MGTOW flyers. That is 2-3 page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 8-9, entitled MGTOWs as Pawns of the Jewish Banksters. Description. This flyer expresses my growing skepticism that the main idea of MGTOW, that is, to avoid fatherhood, to crash the population, to force society to be less gynocentric, will not work. If the massively unjust divorce laws against men were engineered behind the scenes by Jewish banksters to help reduce the world population to 500 million, as stated on the Georgia Guidestones. Flyer itself. MGTOWs as pawns of the Jewish banksters. I'm becoming increasingly suspicious and skeptical of the main MGTOW argument. That is, that MGTOWs are so fed up with our current gynocentric society that they choose to go their own way, refusing to marry, refusing to have kids, and spending their money on themselves as a form of punishment of today's society, thinking that by dropping out of the marriage market and fatherhood, the society will eventually turn around and reform itself so that men get a much better deal than what they have now. The source of my skepticism is my growing knowledge, thanks to the internet, of the enormous damage and criminality of the Jewish Satanist banksters and their deeper and longer term intentions, that is, to destroy the major countries, US, Europe, Japan, and rule the world with their capital in Jerusalem, thus fulfilling their 3,000-year-old prophecy in the Torah and Talmud, their main religious documents. Some of you may have heard of the Georgia Guidestones, YouTube it, which state that the Earth's human population should be reduced to about 500 million. Putting up such stones would not have been cheap, so one wonders who and why they were erected. Some of my recent flyers have been about Jewish banksters and their 2,000-year-old strategy of dividing and conquering the host cultures that they parasite upon, by fostering division and hostility between subgroups of their host culture to distract attention from the host culture's citizens away from the very negative abuses the Jewish banksters and their cronies are committing against their goy hosts. For example, in the US, the creation, funding and leadership behind the scenes of the NAACP, National Association for the Advancement of Coloured People, that's the Blacks Libs organization, which aim to promote hostility between blacks and whites. What the Jewish banksters want the US population to be distracted from is the Jewish bankster theft of Americans' taxes, being made debt slaves to them, assassinating 6 of their presidents, destroying democracy by bribing all the politicians, inflating the currency to destroy people's savings, taking over the sources of information, Hollywood, the media, the news outlets, publishing, not yet the internet, but you can bet your life they're working on that. Passing laws that make it illegal to criticize them in many Western countries, etc. Last I heard it was 17. I've speculated in earlier flyers that the ultimate division, the ultimate distraction for these Jewish banksters would be for a major rift to be created between the sexes. And a very effective way to do that in the 70s would have been to bribe a few critical gender politicians to pass new divorce laws that the feminists were pushing for. These Jewish banksters are evil genii. When you study, for example, how they engineered World War II by bribing and blackmailing a handful of critical players, Churchill, Roosevelt, Stalin, all Jews themselves, and Hitler, probably a quarter Jew. His grandmother was a maid in the Rothschild household in Vienna, who suddenly got pregnant. You learn how they use their genius intelligence and money to push events in the direction they want, by carefully selecting ahead of time critical players who have the ability to influence events the way these Jewish banksters want, to cause millions of goy to slaughter themselves, which satisfies their Shabbatine Frankist Satanist beliefs, and to make enormous profits from governments who borrow heavily from them as Jewish central banksters to pay for wars that the Jewish banksters have played a major role in generating in the first place. If it is part of their plan to rule the world, and more critically, to reduce the world population to about 500 million, then what better way than to create a MGTOW movement? These evil Jewish genii have patience. Their Jewish religious culture is several thousand years old, so they think long term. By bribing just a few gender politicians, as mentioned above, they could reduce the population by crashing the birth rate, by making marriage, or rather divorce, so toxic for men, by creating diabolic divorce laws, as viewed by men. We now see 70%, and rising, of US young men under 35 refusing to reproduce, thus wiping out the US population within a mere century. So if this is what happened, and of course the Jewish banksters would never make such an intention public, otherwise they'd be lynched, then the argument above that MGTOWs hope to force the gender politicians to make the gender laws men fair is probably naive. If the above conspiracy hypothesis is correct, then everything is going according to plan, since the young men are refusing to reproduce on a massive scale in the US and Japan and other countries. So the main aim of the MGTOWs, to force the gender politicians to do what the MGTOWs want, is probably misguided. The gender politicians are controlled, puppeted by the Jewish banksters, and have been for decades. The gender politicians are not going to budge until the Jewish banksters are pogromed out of power, but that probably won't happen until the same Jewish banksters succeed in crushing the dollar, the yen, and the euro, which is probably soon. Months? A few years? But until the root cause of the gender law injustices is removed, that is, the dictatorship of the Jewish banksters over the US Congress, the strategy of the MGTOWs will not be listened to. The population will continue to crash until the Jewish banksters decide that the population is small enough the way they want, and then they will intervene and give men what they want, so that men are more willing to reproduce. So I'm becoming more cynical about pushing and lobbying the gender politicians as a masculist strategy. I'm becoming more cynical that having millions of MGTOWs refusing to reproduce will change the gender laws. If the Jewish banksters are behind the population crash, maybe the gender laws will not change until the population has crashed enough for the Jewish banksters to decide to put back the plug. Of course, if the American people with more guns than people rise up and pogrom the Jewish banksters in the next few years, then all bets are off. If that happens, then a new batch of politicians will be elected, who hopefully will care more about a society as a whole, who are not bribed by Jewish banksters, because the Jewish banksters will either have fled or have been butchered in the American pogrom. These new politicians will then probably pass new men-fair gender laws and improve men's situation in society. Cheers. Prof. Dr. Hugo de GARIS. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. YouTube channel name de GARIS, Masculist, MGTOW, Flyers. Ciao.